always keep liking, always keep sharing. Your support of Northern Vibe is what keeps this great little show going. I've got a really interesting one tonight. If you're interested in listening on hearing about a successful crime writer, explore evil, if you want to know about his take on COVID reporting and the mainstream media, then this is the interview for you. I spoke to Chris Hammer. He's a bit of a legend, actually. Him and I don't agree on absolutely everything, but he's a very successful Australian crime novelist, a great writer. I really like the way that he brings the Australian landscape, making it almost a character. So we had a fantastic conversation about the topics that I've just discussed. And he was good enough to give me a good amount of his time. I've edited this one down to 35 minutes, so it's short but sweet. Please like, please share, but you've heard enough from me. It's now time to hear from the magnificent Chris Hammer. So first question, when can someone call themselves a writer?
Look, anyone who... There's kind of two answers to that. I think anyone who is spending time writing can call themselves a writer. There's a lot of very good writers who may not yet be published yet, but they're still, honing their craft. They're still trying to write books. And of course, anyone who is a successful writer, including those, those kind of rock star international authors that have sold millions of copies, all that sort of thing, they all started the same way, writing in their spare time, late at night on the kitchen table, that sort of thing. So we all have that in common. It's just maybe we're on a different spot on the journey.
Yeah. And as I said, I started reading Scrublands, and your first book, Scrublands, which I do recommend to people, is about a priest who murdered people. Now, I've got to ask, mate, any kind of subliminal messages going on there, Chris? Like, what's...
There's kind of two answers to that. I got no idea where I got the idea from. There's a couple of elements there. I mean, I was a reporter and I went to some sort of remote areas. And I had this idea. So the book starts, there's a prologue, and you're right, a priest, everything seems normal, small country town, priest there chatting with his congregation, goes inside to prepare the church for the morning ceremony and don his vestments, and comes out a few minutes later with a rifle and shoots 5 people dead. And then, as we find out, he himself is killed by the local policeman. And there's an accepted version of why he's done this. The story proper starts with the journalist Martin Scarston arriving in town a year later to write a so-called the story proper anniversary story about how the town's coping. So that idea, I think, I did during my time as a journalist. There were a couple of stories I did a bit like that. One interview I picked up that I'd done a 1-year anniversary story in Aceh in Indonesia, a year after the tsunami there. But really, I think it comes from a time I did a story in a little town in East Texas called Jasper. And I went there, it wasn't a year, but some months after some white extremists had tied an African-American man called James Byrd Jr. to the back of their pickup truck and dragged him along the road until he died. It was a murder that completely horrified America, inured, though it is in many ways, to violence. And I went there some months later, not to do a story on the murder. There was no mystery there. There were lots of witnesses. The cops had caught the guys who did it within hours, and they'd already been found guilty. I did a story on how the town was coping, and that's where I think I got the idea for Martin going to that town a year after something terrible has happened, thinking that he's only doing a story about how the town is coping. But then as he starts researching his story in the town, he realizes the conventional wisdom of why the priest did it is almost certainly wrong. And the more he digs, the more he discovers, of course.
Okay. Well, and
But why a priest and why shooting people? I've got no, I don't know of any such case. I mean, obviously not here in Australia, but even in the States, I haven't heard of anything like that.
yeah, even in the States, which is kind of saying something. But like reading your books, I find that you make the location a character, and that puts a very interesting twist on the concept of a character-driven book, because I genuinely feel like the location is part of the is part like is participating actively. It's not just a background. Can you tell us about writing about place?
Yeah, look, I think you're right there. When I first started writing crime fiction, I thought the plot was everything. I thought what you need is a cracking plot and pretty much everything else is secondary. I moved away from that view now. I mean, I think you still want to make the plot as good as you can possibly make it and have it so that, it's not until very near the end of the book that the reader has a full picture of what happened and who did it and all of that. But I think the setting is at least as equally important as are the characters, as is the voice, in other words, the way the story is told.
Mm.
And my view is that if you get it right, all those different elements come together so that the whole is greater than the sum of the parts.
Mm.
And the setting is very important in that, because what you're doing as a writer is you're inviting the reader to come into this world that you've built. So, leave your everyday life behind, pick up the book and enter this other thing. And so if you think of it like that, then of course the setting has to be important.
Yeah.
And it also lends into the plot and the characters. So in that book, you're talking about Scrublands. It's set in a fictional irrigation town called Riversend, but there's no water in the river.
Mm.
So it's a dramatic setting, but it also explains the motivation of some of the characters. I mean, irrigation town, totally dependent on water with no water. So
Yeah.
desperate times, desperate people, maybe they've done desperate things.
You also talk about the difference between a plotter and a pantser. Would you mind expanding on that witty little anecdote?
So I think this is probably the case in all fiction, but particularly it comes up when you talk about crime fiction writers, because the plot is still an important element in the books, right? So there's kind of two camps, and people in between, whatever, too. But at one end you've got the plotters, and so they'll plot the book out, often in great detail. They'll write treatments of maybe hundreds of pages, and only when they've got the plot and what happens totally, set, then they start writing the narrative.
Mm.
At the other end of the spectrum, you've got the pantsers, so called because they write by the seat of their pants. And I'm a pantser, which means you have a nub of an idea, if you like, and you start writing, and then the book evolves over time as you're writing and the plot begins to emerge. So it's the curious thing is that, someone who now has got some insights into how the sausage is made. I read books, and if they're good books, you really can't tell. Even someone with my insights into the process, you can't tell if it's a plotter or a pantser if they've done a good job.
Well, that's again, it's just, I think it's the little witticism that I love about that so much. But you're also a very disciplined writer. You're not one of those chaps that waits for inspiration. Can you talk through that? Because that's quite different from some of the other writers that I've spoken to.
Look, I tend to write every day or to work on the book every day, and that sounds like I've got great self-discipline. Actually, I'm quite a talented procrastinator. So there's always this kind of tension there. The truth is it's not so much self-discipline as I'm addicted to it. I love doing it.
Oh.
And like being addicted to exercise or coffee or chocolate, whatever. If you don't have some, you don't feel quite right. And so I tend to write every day. And if you write a bit every day, lo and behold, a year passes and you've got a book. Um, uh, and I do find, and maybe this is, you alluded to it then, and maybe it comes out of my journalistic past, is I don't wait for inspiration. And I think that's a problem that some aspiring writers face. They get into a book, they run into a bit of a problem, you know, everything grinds to a halt and they're sort of waiting for inspiration. You can't do that as a journalist. You can't ring up your editor and say, I don't think I'll file a story today. I'm not feeling too inspired. So what I find is,
I can imagine the conversation after that. It's like, you're not kind of what?
There wouldn't be a conversation. You just get the pink slip.
Yeah.
So what I find is, if I start writing, even on those days where I don't really feel like it, I get into a half an hour in, and then it's sort of the creative juices start flowing. And so for me, I find that creativity comes as a consequence of writing, not the other way around. And so I would say that to aspiring writers, if you write, then the ideas will come.
Yeah, and it's funny with the relationship with that discipline, because you don't have to be disciplined if you love it, and if it just becomes a habit. Like, the way you're framing it is really it's a habit.
Yeah. Now I'm really lucky. I get to do this full time. I make enough money out of writing books. It's my job. My kids are grown up. My wife has got her own, demanding career. So I've actually got the time to do it. But, my first book, Scrublands, written late at night, stolen hours on the weekend, like every other successful author, I started like that. It's how everyone starts.
Yeah, and that is very reassuring. So for all the listeners out there, you can do it. Well, you were a journalist for more than 30 years. Pretty stellar career too, if you don't mind me making the observation, mostly in federal politics and international affairs. And you're a roving correspondent for SBS's flagship current affairs program, Dateline. I actually remember seeing some of your work as a teenager and in my early 20s. You then wrote for The Bulletin, a magazine which I loved, and the Melbourne Age. Can we talk about your career? Like, what was your favourite story? You've alluded to one, and obviously I'm thinking, one of my follow-up questions was going to be, what's your saddest story? I'm thinking that's probably going to be the Texas one. But yeah, can you talk about those days?
Yeah, sure. I had a very privileged career. I'm not sure you can have that sort of career nowadays in journalism. I had 2 long stints working for, I worked for SBS, maybe 15 years, 17 years, all up. Some of it in Canberra in the press gallery. A couple of long stints working for Dateline, and I travelled off to some of the most remote places, often several times. So Russia, China, Japan, some really interesting places. And back in the 90s, when I first started doing it, you could just go completely off grid. There was no internet, phone calls were massively expensive. So I just sort of disappear for several weeks and then come back to Australia with a story or two. It was an amazing amount of freedom to be able to do that. So I went to all sorts of places, Cambodia, the Middle East,
Wow,
Pakistan, off into the Caucasus, Armenia, Azerbaijan. I went to Bosnia just as the war had finished there. Indonesia, Papua New Guinea, all through the Pacific. Did a lot of stories in the Pacific, which was fantastic because those little island countries often don't get much attention. So that was I love doing that too.
Any particular story like that stays with you that you're most proud of?
Pretty much all of them. That's the other great thing about that job is even many years later, I can remember pretty much every story. Whereas if you're doing daily news, you can get to the end of the week and you can't remember what you've done that week. Because you're producing so many stories and they're so ephemeral, and often they, say in Canberra, it's this politician said this other politician said that, kind of incremental sort of episodes in larger stories. So no, all those international stories I loved. I was privileged though when I was in the press gallery. I also did a lot of international traveling with prime ministers and foreign ministers. Totally different experience. You're kind of in this bubble, flying this plane with a big group of fellow journalists. So lots of fun, staying in ritzy hotels, all that sort of stuff. Complete kind of opposite to the Dateline sort of work.
Look, so with the Canberra thing, you obviously covering politics. I would imagine tumultuous situations and newsworthy situations would be directly linked with the tumultuousness of an administration. So what administration was the most news creating for you while you were there?
The most exciting for me was in the mid-80s when Hawke was Prime Minister and Keating was Treasurer. That government really, they changed so much. People forget how much it wasn't the madness, the unpredictability and kind of chaos of Whitlam. But, they completely reconfigured the Australian economy. They floated the dollar, they deregulated financial things. They introduced things like Medicare, which we take for granted. They dealt with the AIDS epidemic. They really reconfigured Australian foreign policy. They really changed the way the environment was seen. And of course, I was young, so it was. If I was there now, I'd probably be old and cynical, But that was the most exciting time. Yeah.
Yeah, I got to say, without getting too political, there's a lot of stuff they did in the economic sphere, the Hawke and Keating years. There's no way a Conservative government could have done those things. Like the union movement would have just gone nuts. The only government that could have got that through was a Labor government. But
maybe. Thatcher did it and Reagan did it, but they just did it in more brutal ways. It was coming out of the 70s and stagflation, the oil shocks, US dollar delinking from gold, etc., etc. There was a lot going on in the world, and everyone in the world was trying to come to terms. Australia was in even more, some most drastic states because the Brits had joined the EU. Anyway, let's not bore people.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
an economics lecture.
Yeah, that's right. I got to say, Great Britain joining the EU, that kind of turning their back on us, that really annoyed me. But I digress. Look, you have touched on something very interesting there in regards to the mainstream media and how things have changed so much. The mainstream media is dying, and I'd really just like to talk about that, get your take on it. To start off with to structure the conversation to begin with, why?
Well, it's got to do with the business model. So I'm not sure it is dying anymore, but it's much smaller. So, for example, when I left the Sydney Morning Herald in 2017, the newsroom, the number of journalists employed by it was probably about a quarter of 20 years before. And so all the big commercial media outlets have really shrunk. And the reason's advertising. So the Sydney Morning Herald and Age had classified advertising. It was known as the rivers of gold. It made them an absolute fortune, and it meant that they could invest in journalism. That disappeared almost overnight because all that went to the internet. You look for a house now, you look to buy a car, whatever, you go online. You don't look at a newspaper. And then with the advent of the digital world, a lot of the display advertising started getting taken over too. So they got news sites, but it's something like 90% of online advertising is dominated by Facebook and Google.
Yeah.
Yeah. So just the revenue crunch. And in some ways, the same thing was happening with commercial television.
Yeah.
They can't charge as much for their advertising because there's Netflix and there's, they don't have they can't, if only half the people are watching as 10 years ago, it's hard to charge advertisers the same amount. And advertisers have all these other digital outlets. Now, that seems to have stabilised though. And in the same thing, you had the ABC being defunded. So we couldn't really fill the gap in many ways. I think that's stabilised now. My friends who are working at what was called Fairfax, Sydney Morning Herald, The Age, every year there were these big redundancy rounds. People, voluntary redundancies, and if they couldn't achieve that, they'd have to sack people. That hasn't happened for a couple of years now. They're hiring new staff, and that's come about because of the merger between the old Fairfax and Channel 9. It seems to have stabilised, and there are new players in the market, such as The Guardian, which is a purely online newspaper, but it's come into the mix. So in some ways, it is I think it's as healthy now as it's been for some time, and I'm optimistic for the future. One area though that has really suffered, which I don't feel so much because I live in Canberra, is regional media. A lot of regional papers have been shut down.
Yep.
A lot of regional television and radio has been shut down, and that's really unfortunate.
Yeah, look, a lot of that is to do with regulations and stuff too. I was actually speaking with the editor of the Mount Isa newspaper. This is going back about 3 years ago now. And long story short, and I'm paraphrasing, he said words to the effect of, look, I'd love to buy this paper, and I could actually probably get the backers. It's just that there's all this, all these regulations in regards to ownership and all that kind of stuff. But again, a bit of a digression. What do you think the relationship? Because there's been a deep dip in trust with mainstream media outlet productions. I totally agree with the business model thing. Obviously, where the funding is really going to affect how good your services are. No question about that. Do you think there's a relationship between the partisanship and the culture of mainstream journalism and the trust?
Yeah, certainly that's been the case in the United States, where it's just become extremely partisan and kind of echo chambers. People on the far right listen to Fox News. People on the left listen to CNN and read the New York Times, and it's like there's no crossover. So you've got a mainstream. I think the major commercial television networks are pretty much straight down the line. You've got News Limited to the right. You've got the 9 papers, some kind of small little liberal somewhere in the middle, The Guardian to the left. I hope people do read across. I'm not sure there's been the same loss of faith in the media in Australia that there has been in the United States. A big part of that is the ABC. People respect the ABC and they believe, ABC News. And of course, it plays a very important role in regional Australia too, the ABC, through radio, because it's very hard for commercial radio to make money and to properly resource news and current affairs there. So again, I'm not maybe as pessimistic as you are.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm not seeking argument, I swear to God, but like I do have a slightly different perspective on that, and I'm just interested in a genuine conversation. I agree without qualification in regards to ABC regional stuff, like having lived in rural and remote areas disproportionately in my life. Like that's true. And you do get some very good ABC reporting out there. Like I know most of the ABC journalists here in Cairns, and I knew a lot of them on the Cape Beat when I lived there. I don't have the same. I'm just going to make a statement and just for a discussion point. I just don't have the same amount of trust as the ABC and for the ABC. And I look at the COVID response. Now, I'm fully vaccinated. I got mine, my kids did it and all that kind of stuff. That's not the point. It's like there are a whole group of people out there, and there were lots of them. Like we had big rallies and stuff here in Cairns. These people who were refusing to get the vaccinations. And incidentally, I was in the police at the time when all this started. And I saw the coverage from the news, and it basically was like, look at these extremist idiots who just refuse to conform, and they're kind of dangerous. They're a bit stupid, but that's not reporting. That's editorial. That's forming a narrative. That's pure. That's pure editor. That's just kind of like doing that. The question in my mind is like, why weren't those people down there just shoving microphones in their faces and going, "Why are you here? What's going on?" So rather than reporting what's going on, they were contributing to a narrative. That's how I saw. Again, I'm not a journalist, but that's how I saw. And I can't even say experienced because like I wasn't interviewed or anything like that. Although I have had a lot to do with the media and generally in Cairns with some qualifications. I find them pretty good up here. I really didn't see the mainstream media, especially including, in fact, I'd say especially the ABC covering themselves in glory over the COVID thing. And for me, there were a few other things. Like, again, I have to declare an interest here. Like I was in the police for 30 years. But the way the Black Lives Matter thing was covered, I was just like, oh, okay, we could all be disgusted that copper knelt on that guy's head and murdered him. It's like, yeah, bad. I condemn him. I condemn that act, and I'm glad that he went to prison. But how and why that reflected on me, how and why that was somehow indicative of what was happening in justice administration in Australia, the narrative that was formed by, the mainstream media at the stage just wasn't true. And especially considering the stats out there with deaths in custody and all that stuff are clear. Like the police don't murder Indigenous people in jail. It just kind of doesn't happen. So just that's how I felt and that's how I experienced it. So I'd just be interested in your take.
Well, I think the Royal
It's okay to disagree vehemently. Like it's, like I don't know you from Adam, but like I'm not chasing validation here. Like just tell me what you think.
Well, I think the Royal Commission into black deaths in custody and the annual statistics show that while Indigenous people are not only disproportionately imprisoned, massively disproportionately they die in custody.
Yep.
For all sorts of reasons. I do touch on in my latest book, the one that's out now, a crime fiction book called The Tilt. But it does have some sort of anti-vaxxers and fellow travellers in that. So it's an aspect of crime fiction that you often touch on some of these issues, societal issues. I'm not talking about my own work. I think a lot of crime fiction writers do it, and with that, but not being preachy or didactic, just I think because they're trying to make their books topical. That's what I'm trying to do, and touch on some of the areas that are of concern to readers. I suspect I disagree with you on all sorts of things, but I'm not sure this is the forum for it because I'm here as after all, here as a crime fiction author.
No, and that's fair enough. And look, I'm not after, and I really appreciate your time.
I do think it's overall Australia's response to COVID was pretty good. I think unfortunately the states probably had to do more of the heavy lifting than they should have. I mean, I think some of the areas around quarantine, some of the areas about repatriating Australians particularly was too slow. And I think the acquisition of vaccines was problematic too. But that's all in the past now.
Yeah, look, I mean, it is in the past, but I sincerely hope the government has learnt its lessons. And forcing people to get vaccinated. I have deep, and again, I'm fully vaccinated. I got mine, so it's not like
no one was forced to be vaccinated.
Yeah, they kind of were, actually. Like you lost your job in the police if you didn't. Nurses lost their job. That's just not correct.
That's true. And if you worked in a hospital, I think,
yeah. So they were coerced. And in regards to deaths in custody, like no, it's not correct that Indigenous people die disproportionately in custody. In fact, it's safer. I do know the stats on that. I'm very familiar with them. But anyway, and I think that's what it comes down to. Like, I know lots of journalists. I mean, lots. I've never met anyone who I thought was actively dishonest. Like, I've met heaps of them, Chris. Like
I've met ones that are actively dishonest.
Sorry?
I've met ones who are actively dishonest.
Really? Like, what form does that take? Like, can you?
No, let's stick to crime fiction, hey?
Oh, okay. Oh man, I still want to dig into this. You're titillating me. This is like, ooh, like yeah. And again, like to kind of like to frame, and I suppose we'll back to crime fiction, but to like kind of wrap this up. Like I had a great conversation with Peter Reid, and I asked him outright. I said, look, is there corruption in science with the way that with the way a lot of this climate change stuff is being reported, which just is wrong, some of it. And he said, no, like there aren't people who are actively corrupt in the truest sense of the word. There are people who are ideologically possessed, and I'm kind of paraphrasing here, like the interview is there for people to watch. But there are people who are ideologically possessed and people who will mix up their self-interest with an agenda, but there's not corruption in the truest sense of the word. And that's been my experience with journalism. Like when I say I distrust the media, I distrust a lot of reporting, but almost there's only, I can think of 2 journalists that I just didn't trust. So I just thought, no, this person is actively going to misrepresent what I say. Which, considering the amount of journalists I know, two's too many, but like it's not many considering I know like hundreds. You know what I mean? And I've dealt with hundreds. So that's kind of my take on that. Yeah, but okay, crime fiction. Let's get back to that. Why crime? Like, what drew you? Obviously, so you've done this reporting and stuff, but what is it that drew you into this crime writing?
Look, I'd written a couple of non-fiction books, kind of like travel writing.
Mm-hmm.
Travelled throughout the first book, The River, travelled throughout the Murray-Darling Basin, right at the height of the millennial drought. So from the headwaters in Queensland all the way down through New South Wales, Victoria, South Australia to where the Murray reaches the sea. Really liked doing, and ended up giving me some pretty good locations for my crime books. But I couldn't make any money out of it. And this is true in Australia. It's very difficult to make a living out of writing books. So Sydney Morning Herald and The Age have been very kind in giving me a voluntary redundancy to go and do this. Were very kind of hired me back. But the job they hired me back to do was doing more online videos and interviewing politicians, whatever. I wasn't writing so much. I missed the writing, so I thought, I don't have the time or the resources to do non-fiction, so I'll have a go at writing fiction, making something up. Didn't have the confidence or the ideas to write like a purely literary book, which is probably more what my go-to reading was in those days. I'd read quite a bit of crime, not as much as some people, I tell you, but great admirer of the Americans, noir, the original hard-boiled detective writers like Raymond Chandler, Dashiell Hammett. There were some others like Michael Connolly, but in particular an Australian guy called Peter Temple. He's the guy who wrote the Jack Irish books.
Yeah.
And just by coincidence, he'd been my writing teacher when I did journalism in the early 80s, before he'd published any. I was a huge admirer of his books. So I thought, you know what, I'm going to have a crack at writing crime fiction. I'm so glad I did, because I really enjoy it, because as well as the mystery and the plot, it's a very broad kind of canvas. You can explore character, motivation, psychology, some of those social issues we're talking about, all sorts of things. So it was I wouldn't say it was accidental, but it was very fortunate, I guess, that I chose to write crime.
You're so right that there is, the unfortunate reality is there is something about people who walk on the other side of the line. And I did a 30-year career in the police, and I also know a lot of criminal defense lawyers. And you're right in so much as it really brings character out. It's like you find out who people really are, because the vast majority of people, especially living in a very comfortable Western democracy, really don't know who they are because they've never really been tested. And that's not their fault. I'm not saying that as a pejorative or an insult. I'm just making an observation of what I think is a factual dynamic. So the way we find out about ourselves is we watch a movie, Chris. So you watch Star Wars or something like that, and you'll identify with Luke Skywalker. But it's not until you test it that you kind of find out, actually, I'm kind of probably more like Darth. I think it's only in... That was actually my experience in the police. And like, I'm kind of like... No, seriously. Like, you know, I found out, like, I joined as a 19-year-old. And I had great fun. I went out to Winton and Rockhampton and, you know, all these places, and got paid money to meet new and interesting people and arrest them. No, just kidding. But, you know, you find out, like, when you're confronted with real violence and real moral dilemmas, like, you know, can you do good things? Can you do bad things for the right reasons? You know, what's the difference between a corrupt copper and a tough street cop who's just doing his job? And, like, you know, you find these things out, and not in the abstract.
See, that's one of the great things about crime fiction. You can, as well as telling a rip a yarn, you can explore some of those issues.
So yeah, it got a little bit awkward there, didn't it? You know, because Chris, there was things that kind of like Chris didn't want to go into, but he was really, really gracious with me and let me kind of like push, because I just wanted to get his, really wanted to get his perception on that, because quite clearly we disagree on a lot of stuff. But he's a smart man who's gone all around the world, and he's made a living writing. Like, people pay money to hear what he thinks. No small achievement. Big thanks to Chris for giving me his time. Big thanks to all those who are liking, commenting, and sharing. And I'll see you all next week. I got a